My name is Frey. My presentation this morning is going to be on using MikroTik within GNS3. A little bit of background about myself. I've been in the IT and communication industries for about 20 years. I spent 10 years in the United States Navy. I worked on networks all over the world. I was first introduced to the MikroTik product line back in 2008, so I've been working with MikroTik for about 8 years now. And my main areas of focus have been on wireless services and ISP solutions. So a little bit of background about IP ArchiTechs. We're the first carrier grade, 24/7, 365 technical assistance center. So if you have problems, you can call us. You can reach us at iparchitects.com or at 855-MikroTik. We also have a new product we call Area MPLS, which is a private nationwide 4G backbone partnership with Verizon Wireless to bring in. So anywhere you have Verizon service, this service is also available. And we have internet and non-internet facing services available, private transit, MPLS, BGP. We also do network monitoring, change control, IP management. So the objectives of this presentation is to introduce GNS3, VirtualBox, which is how we bring MikroTik in, and explain how to get it up and running. So GNS3 is an incredible tool, as you're going to see here in a few minutes. But one of the things I hear most commonly when I tell people about GNS3 is, I couldn't get working the first time. And I was in the same boat. I couldn't get working the first time, or the second time, or the third time, because there's a few little things that become stumbling blocks. So the goal of this presentation is to help you get it up and running, use it the first time successfully. So what is GNS3? It's a graphical network simulator. So essentially, this is something that was created in the Cisco world. And eventually, they added VirtualBox, which allows us to run Router OS and many other types of software. And we can build this entire virtual network visually, just as if we were using Visio or the Dude. So why use GNS3? Well, the most obvious reason is training. That was its main intention when it was created. That's probably the most cost-effective way to build up a mock network for training that's available. And the network validation. So this becomes an incredible tool for testing network designs or for testing network changes. And ultimately that reduces our downtime and increases our ROI. And then the next benefit is network design collaboration, which I'm going to talk about a little bit at the end. So GNS3 was first released in September of 2007 as version 0.3. Current stable version is 0.87. 1.0 should be released later this year. 1.0 beta 2 was just recently released. So here's a first look at GNS3. As you can see here in the center, we have our network map just like with Visio with the Dude. And we can drop and drag routers, switches, other types of virtual machines, right here into our network map, and start building networks. Some of the benefits of this are we can have an entirely virtual workspace, or this can be real virtual machines connected to the internet, maybe privately, or these could be functioning virtual machines that are actually doing something on the internet. And one of the other advantages is that we have the common tools. So if any of you have tried to do the training with the virtual machines before, you're constantly interacting with each virtual machine individually. And we can start, stop, pause all instances. We can use tools like Wireshark, what have you. It gives us a much cleaner presentation to work with. So GNS3, in order to bring Router OS into GNS3, we use VirtualBox, which is just another virtualization software like VMware or Hyper-Terminal. Any x86, Intel 64, AMD 64 OSs are compatible with it. There are some limitations that we're going to talk about in a minute, but so here's a closer look. Here on the left-hand side, we have all of the virtual appliances. Over here on the right, we have the information about each of these virtual appliances, and then a preview window. So installing the router OS is very easy. I'm just going to walk through it. There's a few things I want to point out in the wizard, but basically we're going to follow the wizard. The default settings will get you there. So the first part of this wizard, I'm sorry, to get here, to install the virtual machine, we're going to go up to machine and click new, and that's going to bring us to our wizard. And the first thing it's going to ask us for is the name, the type, and the version, which since router OS is based on Debian, that's what I always choose. Next it asks us about the memory. So remember that this virtual memory takes away from the physical memory of the host. So we're probably going to have at least 4, 5, 6 routers inside GNS3. So if we have 5 routers at 512, we've already taken away 2 gigs from our base machine. So just be aware of that. Next it asks us to create the hard drive now, which we do want to do. And then the next window, this is something I personally found very confusing when I first started playing with it. Because all these acronyms that it's talking about are somewhat familiar. But basically, VDI is virtual disk. The virtual disk image is VirtualBox's only native format. So it's the right choice for us almost always. These other file formats allow compatibility between other vendor software. Next it asks if we want dynamically allocated or fixed size, which is pretty self-explanatory. I always choose dynamically allocated for these routers. And then it asks us to set the hard drive size, and it asks us to verify that the location is going to put the hard drives is okay. So, and that's it. It's very simple to install the virtual machine. Once we've done it, we have our brand new virtual machine. As you see, I have router A. It'll actually be at the bottom of the list, but not to the top, it'll be visible. And now we have to install the software. So this, once we hit run, and we're running our virtual appliance for the first time, the default window will ask us where the ISO image is to install the software from. And then it's just like installing router OS on any other x86 platform. So this part we should all be familiar with. You do have to eject the boot media afterwards. So to get there, you go to devices, CD devices, and you can either uncheck the ISO or hit remove this from virtual drive. And then we're ready to access it for the first time. So just a few notes about accessing it. Right now, in its current state, we can access this virtual machine through the command line. It's not necessarily online, it might be online, depending on how the NAT's set up, if we were having it pre-configured. But for the most part, let's just assume that it's not online, and we want to get it there. So we'll stop the VM, and we're going to start, we're going to adjust the network settings, change the network interface to bridge, and to get there, we just simply highlight the virtual machine we want, hit settings, choose networks, and then we're going to change the interface, which you can barely read this, but where it says attached to, the default will be NAT, and we're going to change that to bridge. And bridge, we'll bridge it to our physical interface. So at that point, we can pull a DHCP address or however we want to get online. Just a few notes about the licensing. This, of course, is the best time to license the software. But this is also an invaluable tool for training. MikroTik includes a demo license, which is 24 hours continuous use. So you can build up some pretty complicated networks just using a demo license. Okay, so before we go any further, now's the time to take a snapshot. We want to take a snapshot pretty often. So when we're working with GNS3, we're going to be building up these different projects. Maybe it's our work network, or this aspect of our work network. And every time we get to a stopping point, we're going to take a snapshot of each router. So something to keep in mind, when we save our project from GNS3, it does not necessarily save the VMs. It saves its own information. But we want to take a snapshot of our virtual machines so we can get back to where we want. Okay, so at this point we have the virtual machine, we have the software loaded on, we have the license. And now we need to bring that virtual machine into GNS3. And this is something, I mean, you'll figure it out. Anybody looking at it will figure it out. But it's kind of confusing at first because this whole box is upside down. To get here to this box, in GNS3, we'll go to Edit, Preferences, we'll click on VirtualBox, and we'll go to VirtualBox Guest. I know it's pretty difficult to read this screen, but basically up here, we have the name. This is going to be the name that we assigned. Down here is going to be the virtual machine that we're calling in. But initially, this is blank, and you don't get any options. Then we have the number of NICs that we want the virtual machine to have. The NIC model, which we probably won't ever play with. This is the first time that we see reserve the first NIC, which I'm going to explain here in just a minute. But we also have enable console support and a few other things. So to get this towards doing something, every time we come here, we have to refresh the VM list. Once we refresh that list, then we can choose our virtual machines. Now, because of the resolution on this particular PC, I wasn't able to take a screenshot of it. But down here, there's an OK and apply as well. And this is kind of confusing because the save for what we're doing is right here in the middle. The save down here is going to get you there. So, yeah, it can be a little bit organized. Okay, so at this point we have the virtual machines. Over here on the left-hand side, we have router switches, and this is our virtual guest. And this bottom icon, this is our line linker tool. So we can just drop and drag these virtual machines onto our workspace and then connect their Ethernet interfaces. Afterwards, we can also change their name, we can change their icons. We can use the line drawing tools that are included in GNS3 to make this look a little bit cleaner. And something I want to point out is, at this point, GNS3 is completely functional, but it probably doesn't function the way that we're anticipating it to function. And I think that's something that a lot of people run into is, there's only two ways that we can access these virtual machines right now, both of which are command line options. So we can either interact with the virtual machine itself, or GNS3 includes its own version of PuTTY. So if we right-click on one of these nodes and hit console, we can essentially PuTTY into it. Now this feature right here is fantastic because at this point, let's say I dropped and dragged all these, I've connected their Ethernet ports, but none of these routers have any config on them at all. So the ability to console in is really, really nice. But we can't access, we can't use Winbox, we can't use WebFig. I know there's several tools out there people like to use for scripting. We can't use any of those yet. So we're going to talk about how to get there and how to make this a little bit more useful. So first of all, VirtualBox has a limitation of 8 network interfaces per VM. What makes this a little bit more confusing is only 4 of these interfaces are actually accessible from the VirtualBox software. The other 4 have to be configured from the command line. So when we're designing our layout, the network interfaces we want to change have to be either 1, 2, 3, or 4. So just being aware of that will allow us to plan our design a little bit. And something else to be aware of is VirtualBox has very limited support for jumbo frames. Anything over 1,500 bytes is going to function poorly. So in the beginning, we were talking about to access it the first time, we would change the network mode to bridge. And so we're going to talk about the rest of these bridge or the rest of these networking modes for a few minutes. I think this is something that actually hinders people if they are familiar with VirtualBox. Two of the most common modes that we would use would be NAT and NAT network. Same thing with any other virtualization software. But in this instance, we don't want to use those. And the reason for that is, if we're building up the network, of course, ICMP tools are going to be our most commonly used tools. But ICMP has some very serious problems. Sometimes they'll just outright fail. Sometimes you'll have ping will work, trace route will fail. And that's a byproduct of VirtualBox NAT nodes. So we don't ever want to use those two modes. The bridge we already talked about, and we'll use that quite a bit, particularly for gateways. The internal networking, what this is an attempt to create a pseudo interface where layers 1, 2, and 3 have connectivity, but layers 4 through 7 do not have connectivity. So this isn't particularly useful for us, and it could create some troubleshooting nightmares. The host-only adapters we're about to talk about, those are very useful, and we use them quite a bit. Generic isn't something that we would actually select ourselves, but it is something that GNS3 uses in the background as it's communicating with VirtualBox. So the next thing I want to talk about is reserving the first NIC. This is something that kind of causes some confusion. It is actually pretty well documented. The documentation isn't up front where it should be. So the purpose of reserving the first NIC is when GNS3 is communicating with VirtualBox, it will say make that first NIC an added interface, and then the rest of the interfaces will be the generic. The problem is we don't want the first one to be added, but there are times this is advantageous, and there's times it's not. So there's a few places we can get there. One is by right-clicking on the node, and the other is in the VirtualBox guest list. So some of the pros and cons of reserving the first NIC. If we reserve the first NIC, then what happens is GNS3 stops trying to change that network interface in VirtualBox. So if we need to interact with that interface, this is something that can be very advantageous for us. If we want that particular router to maybe be a gateway and get online, this is something that's very useful. However, if we reserve the first NIC, then we lose our ability to console into that virtual machine. But as long as we have layer 3 connectivity, we still use PuTTY or any other tool, so it's not a huge loss. The next thing to be aware of is reserving the first NIC changes the way the Ethernet interfaces are numbered. So in GNS3, we start numbering with Ether 0. So Ether 0 would equate to Ether 1 in router OS. If we reserve the first NIC, then Ether 1 equates to Ether 1, and that can be kind of handy and reduce some confusion. And here, as you can see, router A has the first NIC reserved, and this is what I was talking about with the Ethernet interfaces. These two routers do not, but well, like I said, where it's not reserved, I can console directly into those. And with this one, I couldn't. So host-only adapters. This is a feature that's very, very useful. So once we build our network, we'll stop our virtual machines, we'll reconfigure some of these network interfaces. And this will allow us to have an isolated layer 3 support, or layer 3 connectivity to a particular interface. If you're comfortable with the CLI, of course you don't need it, but if you want Winbox or WebFig, this is a way to get that access. This is configured completely in VirtualBox. And basically what we're doing is we're taking those network interfaces in our PC, and we're putting them on the same broadcast domain. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. In this example, I have various routers, and the Ethernet ports between them are set with a host-only adapter. So they're on the same broadcast domain, but that doesn't spill over into anything else. And with this router, the one that's labeled tower router, it has an address of 20.20.20.1. The other side is 20.2. So if I configure my PC to be 20.3, then I can just use Winbox as normal and gain access. And I can do that for every single interface on here, regardless of my configuration. So in this particular example, both of these routers have NAT. So does this one. But I would still have that isolated connection to them by using the host-only adapter. So something to be aware of is there are a few bugs with these host-only adapters, to say the least. In VirtualBox, we'll get there. We'll go to File and then Preferences, which will bring up a box labeled Settings. But if you click on Settings, you go somewhere completely different. Just FYI. But under the network, we go host-only adapters, and we'll create our host-only adapter. We can also put a DHCP server on here or a static IP address. But there's a couple things to be aware of. One is, if we ever disable these virtual adapters, which they'll show up in our network settings just like any other network adapter on our computer. If you ever disable them, they're no longer available to you in VirtualBox. And that's kind of frustrating. So you might wonder, why would I ever want to disable it? Well, as we build up these virtual interfaces, if we want to use something like Winbox, when we click on the three dots and we're waiting for those MikroTik discovery packets to get to Winbox, it may take 10, 15, 20 minutes, depending on how many virtual interfaces we have. And of course, as soon as they're all disabled, it starts working correctly. So it's something to be aware of. I mean, there are times I have done it on several occasions, you can see, because of the numbering here. But just be aware that you're going to have to redo some of your work.
Just by adding a new host-only interface back into the ArchiTechs.
Yeah, you'll have to create a whole new host adapter. You have to come to VirtualBox, create the new host adapter, and then in the virtual machine, you'll change its network interface to the new host-only adapter.
Will it renumerate the adapter and ROS when it does that?
It'll keep the same nomenclature on OS. So in router OS, it might be either one or whatever the case is. But in VirtualBox,
so the VMI declaration doesn't change, just which interface it's attached to.
Right. And something else to be aware of is it's buggy. It's just simply buggy. We can figure this. So sometimes all the settings may be perfectly right. You're still going to have to reboot your computer to get it to work. So just be aware of that. So GNS3 does have some limitations. As we talked about earlier, we only have support for 8 network interfaces. And we can also only virtualize wired connections. That's not a huge limitation because a little bit of creativity will make that work just fine. It also has limited weak support for switching. If anybody's familiar with GNS3, you may question there, because it does have some support for Cisco switching. If we're trying to do MikroTik switching, we're not going to get anywhere. It only performs well on hardware designed for VMs. And so if somebody's trying to do this for training, if we're doing it at home or using it on a laptop, we'll get to 3, maybe 4 VMs, and it's just going to crash on us. We're not going to get anywhere at all. GNS3 does now have some support. It's still very limited. Up until just recently, they didn't have support. The GNS3 has come a long way in a very short period of time, so we expect in the next year that'll change quite a bit. And then probably the most common complaint I hear about GNS3 is is we build up this network, and then the production environment didn't work. Well, there's a couple reasons for that. One is, it doesn't matter how much effort we put into the virtual environment, it's not going to be 100% identical to the real network. But it's important, it's very important to stop and figure out what the differences are. Sometimes those differences are just bugs. For example, we've had a lot of strange bugs with the CCRs, the RB2011s. When we go to the production environment, we start finding those bugs. But if we understand what those bugs are, then we can work around them. And GNS3 is a great platform to find a second choice solution. And if we're focusing on the network mythology, we can usually get around just about anything we encounter. So in conclusion, GNS3 is one of the best platforms to use for training for network validation. And the reason for that is this is a solution that's portable, it's scalable. Anybody can put it on their laptop, or you have this hosted on a server for employees to access. It can be shared with others. So whether it's hosted or we've come up with some other creative solution, you can get multiple engineers or multiple students, looking at the same network, a network which is laid out in a way that we would normally visualize a network, and they can all be working on collaborating to come up with a solution. And last but not least, is there's an incredible number of resources out there for both GNS3 and VirtualBox. YouTube probably being the most notable. So anybody can quickly get up to speed with GNS3. Okay, well, thank you for listening to the presentation. Oh, one last thing. We will be giving away four helicopters throughout MUM, two each day. So to be eligible for the helicopter giveaway, there are two steps. One is like us on Facebook, and the other is you have to private message us with your contact info. And don't forget the second step, or we won't be able to call you and tell you you won. So be sure to stop by our booth afterwards and come say hi. So does anybody have any questions?
Have you had any success actually exporting a VMDK disk from VirtualBox after you've run it in GNS3 into, say, a VMware environment that's running?
I have not. I've tried playing with the interoperability between VMware, VirtualBox, and GNS3, and I haven't had much success at all. I have had some success moving my project from one GNS3 platform to another. But the virtual machines, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So.
Yeah, hello. The GNS3, okay, how does it relate to a router box itself? How can I use it with a router box?
Well, you're installing Router OS on the virtual machine. So every single feature that MikroTik has is available to you in GNS3. And when you go install it, you choose which packages you want. So all the advanced routing, advanced features in the routing is all available.
Okay, so what you're trying to say in essence is that it has no relationship with a router box. Because where I come from, we have a router box here and installed.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, we're just virtualizing the router. It doesn't have any.
It doesn't have any relationship with a physical MikroTik as a box at all?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
All right. That's just what I wanted to establish. Then as number two, can we get a copy of your presentation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Any more questions?
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.